Welcome to this event organized by the Department of Archive Studies at the Institute of Global and Historical Studies at Government College University, Lahore. Today, I have the utmost pleasure to be hosting this panel discussion in celebration of Dr. Adnan Tariq's book, Lahore at Partition. I am being joined by Dr. Adnan Tariq, Professor Ian Talbot, Professor Sara Ansari, and Professor Yasmin Khan. Thank you to all of our participants for taking out their valuable time in joining us today. It is certainly an honor to have them here with us. Before we begin the event, please allow me to introduce our esteemed guest speakers. Professor Sara Ansari is a professor of history focusing on South Asia at Royal Holloway University of London. She has been an academic member of the Council from 2015 till 2021 and has also served as the chair for the Charles Wallace Pakistan Trust. She is currently the president of the Royal Asiatic Society, including being the first woman editor of the journal since its inception in 1864. Her research focuses on Sindh and the impact of partition on identity politics, including citizenship, gender, and migration. She was the co-investigator of the AHRC project, From Subjects to Citizens, which explored everyday interactions between the state and the individual following independence, leading to her book, Boundaries of Belonging, co-authored with Professor William Gold. She has also spearheaded research projects within Pakistani universities, including the British Academy-funded early career writing workshops. Since 2015, she has been working with various community groups, schools, and think tanks to raise public awareness about the impact of partition, especially within Britain. She also co-chairs the Partition Education Group, which aims to establish the annual South Asian History Month. Next, we have Professor Yasmin Khan with us, who is a historian of British India and an associate professor at the University of Oxford. She completed her BA in history and later her DPhil in Imperial and Commonwealth history at the University of Oxford. And she was previously a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh and at Royal Holloway University. Her research focuses on the British Empire, decolonization in South Asia, refugees, and the aftermath of the Second World War. Her first book, The Great Partition, The Making of India and Pakistan, won the Gladstone Prize for History and was also longlisted for the Orwell Prize. Professor Khan has also authored The Rajat War, A People's History of India's Second World War, and has edited An Imperial World at War, The British Empire from 1939 till 1945. She has held various research grants from the British Academy, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the Leverhulme Trust. She has also been published in notable journals, including the History Workshop Journal, for which she is also an editor, Modern Asian Studies, and the Roundtable Commonwealth Journal of International Affairs. She is also a trustee of the Charles Wallace India Trust and works with organizations such as the Imperial War Museum, the Memorial Gates Trust, and the Historical Association to improve research accessibility. Professor Khan has written for and has appeared in numerous UK media platforms, including The Guardian, Channel 4 News, and the BBC. We also have Professor Ian Talbot with us, who is a professor emeritus in the history of modern South Asia at the University of Southampton, where he was formerly the head of the history department and the director of graduate studies in the Faculty of Humanities. Prior to this, he was a professor and director for the Center of South Asian Studies at Coventry University. He completed his undergraduate in BA Modern History, Economic History, and Politics at Royal Holloway. He also received an MA in History from the University of Oxford and a PhD in History from the University of London for his doctoral thesis, The Growth of the Muslim League in the Punjab from 1937 to 1946. Ian Talbot has written extensively on the themes of colonial Punjab, the partition of India, and Pakistan's political history. He has published 10 monographs, 3 jointly written volumes, and 6 edited volumes, alongside numerous books and chapters. Some of his notable works include, but are not limited to, Lahore in the Time of the Raj, The History of British Diplomacy in Pakistan, Divided Cities, Partitioned and Its Aftermath in Lahore and Amritsar from 1947 to 1957. He has also been providing independent research for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office since 1999 and is also a member of the Council of the Royal Asiatic Society. He was previously the chair of the British Association for South Asian Studies and a member of the British Academy South Asian Panel. Professor Talbot has held various fellowships at the University of Warwick, Balliol College, and was a senior visiting research fellow at the South Asia Institute at Harvard University. He is currently working on a project on the 75th anniversary of partition and is also working on the environmental history of South Asia. Last but not least, the star of the show, we have with us Dr. Adnan Tariq, who is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Archive Studies at Government College University, Lahore. He did his undergraduate from the Forman Christian College, a chartered university in Lahore. His master's and MPhil in history are from Government College University, Lahore. And his PhD is from the Department of Pakistan Studies and History at Punjab University, where his dissertation focused on the impact of partition of India on the city of Lahore. He earned his postgraduate fellowship from the Royal Holloway University of London. His areas of research include the historiography of South Asia, notably the Muslim community. Dr. Adnan is also currently working with the Punjab Walled Cities Authority to restore the Lahore Fort archives in the Haveli of Kharak Singh Khel. Before formally commencing the event, I would also like to issue a trigger warning for our audience, as the subject matter of this event contains details of violence, tragedy, and trauma. Now that the formal introductions are over, let us take the conversation further from here. So we will start with Dr. Adnan Tariq and sort of ask him about his personal journey in producing his insightful book, and particularly what inspired you to look into this subject matter and how did you and your ideas evolve over time. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Raja Salim Sehgal, for such a generous introduction in the presence of the great intellectuals we have in this panel. Thank you so much once again. I would like to thank all the panelists, Mr. Professor Ian Talbot, Sara Ansari, and Yasmin Khan as well. Okay, let me start with the introduction of my research journey, as you asked in your question. My research journey is about this book, was basically my PhD dissertation. I got enrolled in Punjab University in 2012. And my professor Iqbal Muhammad Chawla was my supervisor. He told me that Professor Ian Talbot, who is also his professor at Southampton University in his postdoctoral studies, he told me that Ian Talbot has told him that one of your students should work on the city of Lahore because the partition impact on the city of Lahore has not been properly studied. Also, the fact is that Mr. Ian Talbot has produced very impressive and very noteworthy work on the cities of Lahore and Amritsar, the tale of twin cities, which has been published by Oxford University Press in India and in Pakistan as well. So my earlier, or my, I would like to say that my earlier one inspiration was primarily from Mr. Ian Talbot's books. And that is indeed the extension of that work, not in the theme which Professor Ian Talbot has presented in his book, but I have tried my best to enhance the scope of the study by incorporating many such angles, many such avenues which has not been explored by the previous researchers on the violence in the partition of India and the Lahore as a locality. And the second inspiration of my work is also from one of the students of Mr. Ian Talbot, who is Ilyas Chattha. His book on Gujranwala and Sialkot is indeed one of the finest edition in the scholarship on the partition historiography and partition violence and the rehabilitation of the refugees. My inspiration led me to indulge in such avenue which has not been explored before. For example, I have incorporated such kind of interviews of the culprits who have done actual violence in the city of Lahore. It was very difficult. It was very difficult to reach out those persons, but somehow I have managed. And let me introduce about my conceptual framework. My research is not primarily based on a theoretical framework. Rather, it's a kind of conceptual framework which incorporated three main keywords. One is the theory of genocide, and second one is the concept of locality, and third one is the rehabilitation of refugees in the city of Lahore. I have completed my PhD from Punjab University, and during this journey of PhD, I have also got the opportunity to be with Professor Sara Ansari at Royal Holloway. I have got a scholarship for 6 months tenure at University of London, and under Sara Ansari, I have learned a lot how to improvise my argument and how to conduct research in a way which is the requirement of the modern historiography. And thank you so much. This is a brief what I can say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adnan. I guess we'll start with an opening round for all of our panelists here. Of course, violence being a key defining feature of your book and of Partition generally as well. So I just want to pose to our panelists that what for you was the rupture moment, or that sudden epiphany that, the damage done has, reached an irreversible moment. So what was the rupture moment of violence for all of you? And secondly, you talk about the locality of genocide as well. So in terms of how violence was targeted in specific locations, do you see some sort of spatial symbolism of the locations of violence? So in no particular order, I'll just follow the order in which I've been shown the panelist. Professor Talbot, please.
Right. Shall I start then? I think the first thing which is important is to see that there are perhaps different rupture moments in different provinces of India. So if we're looking at Bengal, for example, then the August 1946 Great Calcutta killing could be seen as a rupture moment in the sense of it was a different kind of violence to what had happened before, though the city had had communal riots in the 1920s. But in terms of the numbers of people that died, the displacement of populations, I think about 10,000 people were displaced after this. I think this all set a new cycle, which I think I called partition-related violence in the book that I did with Gahapur Singh. So from Bengal, we would certainly say the Calcutta killings. I suppose for Punjab, the Rawalpindi massacres would be a moment in which there was a decided change in both the level of violence, again, the organization of violence. We're talking about March 1947 here. Also, I think the Rawalpindi massacres set an unfortunate precedent in that whilst some of the people who perpetrated that violence were named, because of the backlog in legal cases and because of the fact that the British were shortly to depart, there was no real justice given to victims or people convicted and imprisoned as a result of this. And I think that this established a notion which was carried over on both sides of Punjab and elsewhere, for that matter, in the subcontinent, that in August 1947 you could get away with violence with impunity, and that the state would be unable or unwilling to prosecute you. So I would see these two sort of episodes as being quite significant. I mean, there are other episodes in the cycle of violence which is sparked off by the Calcutta violence. Bihar, for example, Noakhali, another very important place. So depends whereabouts in the subcontinent we're looking at. But I think all of these, as I argued in the chapter that I wrote for the Partition of India CUP volume, you do see a change from what could be called a more traditional type of communal violence and this partition-related violence, which has many different characteristics and locations. And I think that that's important. In terms of political purpose behind it as well, that's another difference. Traditional communal violence was often around disputed sacred space. It was around clashes when religious processions passed by mosques, for example. It was also obviously when there were particular religious festivals which coincided. There was less political purpose, I think, in these earlier episodes. And also there wasn't the invasion of domestic space, which occurs particularly with the targeting of women as victims of violence in the later phases leading up to August 1947. I think I've said enough now for the moment, but hopefully that set out some of the parameters for this.
Thank you very much. We'll move to Professor Yasmin Khan next.
Thank you. I think Ian's given an incredibly full and comprehensive answer to that question, so I don't have a lot to add in terms of specifics. But I think Dr. Adnan's book shows very well that kind of juncture that happens in March 1947 in Lahore between this perhaps more traditional type of violence where people knew and anticipated processions on certain days around religious festivals, and then this conflagration, which starts to draw in many more people, is much less controlled, is spiraling out of control, and is taking on new and very frightening forms. And I think I've seen that a long time ago. I did work on UP in particular, and on a one episode of violence that happened there in Gamukteshwar, and it was really shocking to see this, what might be seen as quite a relatively small incident. It's not famous in the annals of partition. The processes around that, what happened, and the fact that an inquiry was called by the governor, but it never happened. The police became very partisan. Refugees started to leave the area, and you could see in a sort of microcosm of the sorts of things that were starting to happen. That was in November 1946, but the sorts of things that were starting to happen that were becoming these kind of thresholds beyond which it was very hard to wind back and to return to the sort of normality that had preceded those points.
Thank you so much. Professor Sara Ansari, please.
Thank you again. I mean, I think Ian and Yasmin before me have covered a great deal, but I'll just say, I suppose, if you're posing a question about whether it being, you know, a rupture moment or a build-up, I suppose both are part of the equation that I would just emphasize. Obviously, historians like Ian have emphasized or highlighted that there was a build-up of a new kind of typology of violence from let's say, August 1946 onwards, that blazed its trail, you know, all the way up to, in the end, NWFP. But then I suppose the violence that exploded in the Punjab in early 47, you know, is generally recognised as having taken the crisis to a new level. Most of my own research work has focused not on the Punjab, but on Sindh. And actually, we just need, I think, to factor in or to recognise that you know, violence continued, you know, obviously after independence and partition took place. And it's really, I suppose, January 48 when Sindh experiences its most severe kind of bout or episode of violence in January that year. So although violence is very much embedded in and part and parcel of the story of explaining, I suppose, in some ways, you know, what happened at partition, again, to quote Yasmin, you know, it's much longer than a moment. It's a drawn out process, and the violence carried on. And Ian, in his own book that he's just mentioned, takes the story of partition's violence through to the early 50s in Bengal, when in a sense it circled back and sort of got back to Bengal after sort of working its way around the subcontinent with great ferocity. So those are the points that I would make in response to your question, Raja.
Thank you very much. I guess all of you have touched upon this theme that there was a new typology of violence being classified in this era. So Dr. Adnan, you touch upon this in your book as well, where you have this debate about whether partition can be seen as a genocide or a genocidal act. So we just wanted you to elaborate a bit more on that, especially when there's this whole notion of voluntary migration. But as we've seen, because of the violence, it was mostly, you know, no other option left. So forced displacement. So, Dr. Adnan, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you, Raja. After the assessment, a very comprehensive assessment by Professor Ian Talbot, Professor Yasmin Khan, and Sara Ansari, I have I have very few words to say, but I would definitely like to extend these dimensions into the city of Lahore. I would say that as far as before going into the details, whether it was a genocide case of genocide in Lahore or not, I would like to say what was the rupture movement in terms of violence in the city of Lahore. The rupture movement is a very famous incident. That is the Great Fire of Shah Almi Bazaar. I would like to tell you one important about one important description about the Shah Almi incident, and that is that the Shah Almi Great Fire, we have not come across the deaths. We have not found not even a single death was occurred in the Shah Almi incident, but the significance of the Shah Almi Great Fire was very important. It was the most important or most detrimental incident in the history of violence in the city of Lahore. And why the Great Great Fire of Shah Almi Bazaar was planned? The reason behind it was socio-politics. It was a political desire of those sections in the city of Lahore. I don't want to name them, but those sections was of the opinion that the Hindu traders class, which was the main commercial center, which were the main commercial segment in the city of Lahore, not only in the city of Lahore, but also in the United Province of Punjab. The Muslim sections were of the opinion that the Hindu trader community are not leaving Lahore permanently. Rather, they are moving to the safer sides of the eastern Punjab or other side of UP, etc., for the time being. And when they will find the situation is getting normalized, they will come back. So in order to make them not to come back, the Great Fire of Shah Almi was planned. That was a rupture movement in the city of Lahore before the incident of Shah Almi Bazaar from the 3rd or 4th of March to the mid of June. We will find the traditional sort of violence in the city of Lahore, which could be classified under the definition of riots, and to some extent with many cases of arsonage and some slight variations in the types of violence. I will come later on the typology of violence, but I would like to now answer to your question. What is genocide? The partition of genocide is a violence which is conducted by a state. The state involvement should be a very essential ingredient or essential part behind perpetuating genocide. In that context, it is quite difficult. It's a kind of problematic in research methodology to define the partition violence in whole of India as genocide. But according to one expert opinion, it could be considered as genocidal, not genocide per se as per definition, but it could be considered as genocidal. In Lahore, I can tell you that on a very neutral research-based opinion I would like to extend is that we can hardly find any sort of massive scale of violence which could be considered or which could be considered as a type of genocide. In the city of Lahore, we come across 2 or 3 cases of massacre. We come across random street stabbing, many cases of random street stabbing. If I would quote the numbers of police reports and the newspaper reports and the other official reports, we come across more than 1,700 plus cases of stabbing and street stabbing in the city of Lahore. And later on, if I would like to add another theme that is very important in the city of Lahore. If we want to present the city of Lahore in respect of the violence, it is primarily an image of the arsonage. It's the city with a huge image of fires, not a city with the huge cases of bloodshed. We have not found enough bloodshed. I'm not using the. I'm using the word enough in comparison with the violence which happened in the city of Rawalpindi, in the Rawalpindi division, in the Potowar Plateau, as Professor Ian Talbot has rightly pointed out that the Rawalpindi massacre was a starting rupture point in the province of Punjab. So it is quite difficult for me to compare the city of Lahore with the happening in the Potowar Plateau, the Hazara Belt, Hindko-speaking area, and after that, in the city of Multan, we have come across a very unprecedented and the huge scale of violence. But in the city of Lahore, it is more about the fires, more about the arsons, rather than the bloodshed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Everyone would have experienced it on an equal basis as well. So I'll turn to Professor Saransari now in terms of how did women and the untouchables sort of navigate partition violence, and how did they sort of consolidate this in the lead up to citizenship as well? How would their experience been marked differently than perhaps segments of the population?
Thank you, Roger. That's a very interesting question, I think, because while it rightly places both women and so-called untouchables or Dalits within the category of marginalized groups, this doesn't mean that their experiences of partition-related violence was identical. I think, now as we, I suppose, all appreciate, women could be and were disproportionately affected by this violence thanks to the way they were so often deemed to represent or embody the honor, of their communities. Hence, their targeting by men belonging to other communities who exploited women's, I suppose, physical vulnerability, sexually abusing, killing, or famously abducting them in large numbers. And there are also the well-known stories that I'm sure many people listening to this book launch will be aware of how women could also sometimes be killed by their own family members or be prepared to sacrifice their own lives in order to preserve group or family honor in this acutely uncertain, violent context. And it was this reality that prompted Nehru's very, I suppose, famous comment that women were partition's chief sufferers. I'm sure we've all come across that. When it comes to Dalits, the picture was a somewhat different one, at least as far as I've been able to tell. Theirs remains definitely an understudied experience, even when compared with that of women. And Urvashi Butalia, in her famous book back in, 1998, The Other Side of Silence, flagged up both women, children, and so-called untouchables as experiences that hadn't at that point been properly explored. And I suppose in some ways Dalits, like local Christians of the time, they've slipped through partition's historical net or cracks, a seemingly invisible presence that or whose experiences need to be brought more, I suppose, clearly into focus. Though obviously there is now work being done, particularly on the Christian side of things in the context of Pakistan. And again, I'm thinking of Ilyas Chatter here, whose name will be mentioned probably more than just a couple of times during this book launch. When it comes to consolidating identities through citizenship after 1947, again, it's a complex story on both sides of the new border. If we take the case of Pakistan, then we see women's groups emphasizing the centrality of women to the nation, to state building activities taking place there after independence, and I suppose pushing for more equality really within the constitutional framework as well as in other aspects of life. But of course, these initiatives were often associated with particular classes of women, more elite women, and so it remains, for me at least, debatable how effectively they represented and I suppose the lives and aspirations of women across the class spectrum. And just to make a last point, Dalits obviously continue to find themselves in the main disadvantaged after 1947, despite commitments, for example, in the Indian Constitution to address the inequalities that blighted their lives. And in Pakistan's early decades, they had the double disadvantage, I would put it, up to 1971 maybe, of being disproportionately part of East Bengal or East Bengali society. Obviously, there was a presence in Sindh as well, but because of this sort of connection to East Pakistan, I suppose they became caught up in the Muslim, non-Muslim complications of East-West Pakistani politics. So I think it's, how can I put it without sounding too hot? There wasn't really a promised land awaiting either women or Dalits once they'd crossed over that sort of August 14th, 15th, 1947 divide. Life was not transformed for the better for the vast majority of them in terms of their rights as equal citizens within the new states that had been just created.
Thank you so much. I guess since we're talking about different categories as well, and with partition as a new typology, we also have the category of partition refugees as well. So I'll turn to Professor Talbot over here and ask him about how the status and particularly the victimhood or agency of refugees was sort of integrated within the state narrative. Were they being used as a tool? Were they deliberately being portrayed as helpless when in fact they were quite self-reliant? So how was their status sort of integrated with the state narrative?
Thank you. I think that the states had, perhaps the two states had different perspectives on partition, and that was partly reflected in how the refugee narrative played out. The Indian state, it was very much seen partition as a tragedy, you know, and which had accompanied this long-term struggle against the colonial rulers for independence. I think in Pakistan, obviously, that sort of approach couldn't work because you couldn't call something which led to the creation of your own state a tragedy. And I think here in the Pakistan narrative, it's much more a case of the sacrifice of the refugees and those, of course, who never made it across the border, both from UP and also from particularly East Punjab. And the sacrifice was part of the necessity for the achievement of Pakistan. So those are two slightly different narratives which are around tragedy and sacrifice. Also, what was similar to the states, both states, was that how they coped with this totally unexpected mass migration was part of the state's narrative of legitimizing itself. Because at one level, the two states had started off, you could argue, really on the worst possible footing, because they had failed to protect minority communities. Yet they somehow had to provide legitimization, and it was done in terms of the role that the state played in the processes of rehabilitation of refugees, and also to a lesser extent how they assisted the migration through military evacuation as well. Now, of course, these elements in the state narrative perhaps meant that there was less interest in talking in terms of refugee agency, in terms of self-settlement, for example. So that there was a playing down of perhaps the role of how refugees rehabilitated themselves in order to emphasize how the state rehabilitated refugees. And I think that is part of the explanation, certainly, for why this element is sidelined to an extent. When refugees are featured in state narratives, it's very much in terms of pity for them and the terrible state that they arrived in and how they needed state support, rather than the fact that some of these refugees were very self-reliant and revealed quite early on entrepreneurial sort of acumen that enabled them to recover from what had been a devastating loss of property and lifestyle, and also, of course, community members. Then finally, there's the issue which we've already touched on to a certain extent, you know, which relates to the abduction of women. And again, presentation of women as victims of partition. And in a sense, the state having a responsibility. This certainly comes out in some of the Indian state narratives. The state has a responsibility because of this to redress the abduction by recovering women, whether or not, you know, and this is what was uncovered by Butalia and others, whether or not the women wanted to be recovered. So that there is this also narrative, you know, again, around about the state, which is sidelining perhaps what the wishes of victims might be. So I think throughout you have the state approach being one that tends to emphasize its own role, its own capacity for dealing with this this problem, and in the process it sort of ignores both the wishes of refugees and also their own contributions to their recovery of loss.
Thank you so much for that. I guess we'll move on to Professor Yasmin Khan, because of course, at this moment, we're also seeing a fallout of the Second World War and a lot of assistance for refugees being debated in international forums as well. So what I wanted to ask was, how might partition be entangled with the wider violence of decolonization in this time period, also the fallout of the Second World War? And do you sort of see the violence being implemented into the colonies, sort of reverberating back and to and forth from the empire? So just sort of situating partition in the global time frame at this point.
Well, I think when we stand back from the South Asian case, which is large enough, but if we pan out and think about the world at this point, it's the age of the refugee. There have never been so many people on the move, displaced refugees in world history as there were in the 1940s. And epic numbers, sort of 80, 90 million in China. In Europe, I think in 1948, you've still got nearly 1 million people in refugee camps in Europe itself. So this is a time of real ferment and trauma around the world. And what that means, I think, within the Indian and Pakistani cases, that the attention to those refugees doesn't come, and this fits very well with what Ian was just saying, in the sense that things like the UN refugee convention, the UNHCR, those things are actually all come later. They all come within a couple of years of partition. So partition falls between the gaps. It doesn't have the support of really in any substantial way of the International Red Cross. There isn't much international capacity for supporting those refugees, and that means much more onus is placed on the actions of the states themselves. I suppose the other thing to say about this is, for a long time in Europe as well as in South Asia, this idea of ethnic homogenization had been growing. The idea that somehow people should be moved to be made into ethnically more coherent blocks and into states where somehow everybody could kind of belong together because they came from the ethnic group. And of course, this sort of myth or idea in reality was much more messy. But since the 1920s, we've seen that with the Ottoman Empire and the movement of Muslims out of Greece and of Christians, Orthodox Christians out of the Ottoman Empire. So there were lots of precedents in a way for what happened in South Asia. And at the end of the Second World War, that's still ongoing in Europe with the Potsdam Treaty of ethnic Germans being moved out of Czechoslovakia, and huge numbers, 3 million Germans moving at that time. So it's not to minimize what's happening in partition, but just to set it in that global context, I think is it gives us a different viewpoint. And then the third and final thing, I suppose, is within South Asia itself, you do have the fallout of the Second World War, this massive return of demobilized soldiers, up to 2 million soldiers serving in the armed forces from South Asia in the Second World War. They've been trained, they often have arms, they have uniforms, they're coming back, they've sent remittances to their families, there have been deaths, there have been prisoners of war. So obviously many of those from areas that now make up Pakistan, from Punjab, from Northwest Frontier Province. So there's also that, I think, and Ian and others have written about this, but how soldiers then also become involved in the politicization. I think one of the things that's very interesting in Dr. Adnan's book was the evidence of soldiers actually getting involved in the violence, which is something we don't often see. We've heard about the police sometimes in some of the writing about partition, but to actually see evidence of people seeing soldiers themselves being drawn into this too.
Thank you so much. I guess you touched upon, Dr. Adnan touched upon this earlier as well in terms of riots versus crowds as well. So I just wanted to ask Professor Talbot, since he's written about the role of the crowd and its politics in South Asia. So if you could elaborate on the role of the crowd during this period, and sort of, we also see the crowd being mobilized in different ways, as you mentioned, in processions or celebratory occasions versus when it comes to a riot as well. So how would the nature or the structure of the crowd be evolving throughout this time?
Thank you. I mean, this is an interesting area of research in the sense that how much our colonial stereotypes of crowd action carried over into accounts of the partition violence in the period leading up to it. Because often, if you read, and Ilyas Chatter has done this far more than anyone else, but if you read police records of violence in crowds, often they're repeating the vocabulary of the colonial state. You know, it's very much criminal groups who are named in this violence. It's very much seen as something which is sort of, in a sense, against all the values of a rational state, and that there's an irrationality also, as well as a criminal element, which comes out in the reporting. But that reflects, as I say, how communal riots were written about in India by the British, you know, really from the 19th century onwards. And it's partly, of course, to separate the colonial state from the other, the Indian other, who may not be rational. The colonial state is. There's that element to it. There's also, by making it a law and order issue, you can actually perhaps make it more understandable, but also perhaps occlude some elements of the violence which you don't really want to admit to. And I think that element is there in some of the reporting of the violence itself. However, there are similarities between violent crowds and celebratory crowds, that, to pick up the point, Raja, you were making, that crowd activity, you know, and there's been work on crowds from the French Revolution period, sort of studying that through to more modern day crowd activities. Crowds are often groups which, in one way or another, confirm solidarity across ethnic groups. And I think that's important. So celebratory crowds in Muslim League processions were confirming a particular identity. Just as violent crowds, by picking out people from other communities, were confirming that within our own community, we're united, when of course all communities were actually very diffuse, you know. But by the end of it, the label Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh, you know, was the only label really that counted. And yet the reality was that people were very much divided, you know, along sectarian lines, you know, along linguistic lines, as well as religious lines. So I think that the element of the crowd, both as a celebratory crowd and in violence, is partly about solidifying community identity. And that's common across this period leading up to partition. The final point really I want to make about crowds is that, and we've already touched on this in a number of our sort of questions and answers, is that whilst, yes, there were actions which were totally hot-headed, emotionally driven, brutal, also there was calculation in the use of violence, in terms of the organization of violence. We talked a little bit about the role of soldiers, returned soldiers in this, the role of the police. There was also, I think, calculation in terms of what was targeted. You know, and Adnan, you were mentioning Shalalmi. I mean, that's a very important, as you say, rupture point in Lahore's history, because here is the center of Hindu power, in inverted commas, and commercial presence, residential presence, sacred space, all of these things, you know, in one area. So to target that area, you know, through sort of arson primarily, is a calculation. You know, this will, if you like, ethnically cleanse, you know. And when we're talking about genocidal, I was thinking of, when you were answering that question, Adnan, that ethnic cleansing, I think, particularly in the context of Lahore, makes a lot more sense if we want to conceptualize the violence, than genocide, But the fact that it's targeted means that there's a rationality behind it, and that's important. So you can't just write this off, as the August madness, a month of madness. People didn't know what they were doing. They were taken over by emotion. There's far more to it than that.
Thank you so much, Professor Talbot. I guess I'll pose the next question to both Professor Sara and Professor Yasmin. You've spoken about crowds, but of course they have a trigger point as well. So I just wanted to ask about the nature of propaganda at the time and whether or not the crowds were sort of swayed by it. And secondly, Professor Yasmin, you touch upon this in your book, as does Dr. Adnan in his, that there was an essential closure of the press and there were a lot of communication hurdles amidst partition violence. So, how were these services affected? Be it the press, the telegrams, and sort of how were rumors and paranoia filling up this vacuum and sort of exacerbating the situation. So with Professor Sara first about the propaganda nature, and then with Professor Yasmin about the communication gap.
Thank you. Yeah, I think two words that Ian used just before. One was diffuse and one was calculation. And I think we can, in a way, take those words forward into any sort of discussion of or thinking about, the use of propaganda at the time, because I think the nature of propaganda was multi-fold, involved different messages targeted at different interest groups. And I suppose that shouldn't surprise us, bearing in mind the range of possibilities that independence represented and the fact that partition could be and was understood in different ways by contemporaries. So, different horses for courses or different, messages. I suppose I have to go back a little bit. If we consider the forces that by the middle of the 1940s were pushing the idea of some kind of Pakistan as the way forward, then, as historians have highlighted, a key element was the vocal support from local religious leaders that the Muslim League was increasingly able to harness. And people usually look at those important provincial elections of, 45, 46. I mean, messages along the lines of sort of Islam in danger used to rally support among constituencies of voters or Muslim voters in places like the Punjab, I suppose. Constituencies that perhaps hadn't been that interested in or particularly interested in what the Muslim League was promoting. So Ian, and we turn back to Ian again, and others like David Gilmartin have really helped us to reveal this process at work in the province as it turned to the League and very late in the late colonial period. And, from my own work, looking at the province of Sindh, we see a similar pattern there, where the Sajada Nasheens of important shrines switched to encouraging their murids to support the League's prescriptions for the future, deploying much the same kind of arguments to justify a vote for that party or that future, maybe. But I don't think we should fall into the trap of assuming that the story was the same everywhere. And while we've been focusing mostly our discussion on the sort of the Northwest, so Punjab, NWFP and so forth, we did start our conversation today by remembering what had happened in Calcutta in August 1946. So in Bengal, much of the support that emerged within that province linked to the Muslim League was, explicitly much more closely tied to, I suppose, the socioeconomic circumstances of local Muslims, with the result that it's often argued that there was arguably a greater appeal to class-linked interests, let's just say. And I suppose even in Punjab and other parts of the Northwest, we find leftists, people on the left, famously members of the Communist Party, for example, who, believed that Indian Muslims, supported the League in the run-up to independence on the grounds that Indian Muslims had the right to national self-determination. And for them, they were holding out the promise of a vision of Pakistan that was as a much more equal place. So there is different kind of what I am placing under this sort of umbrella heading of sort of propaganda taking place. And of course, this combined rhetoric didn't necessarily get the intended results, with NWFP famously bucking the trend and voting in a sort of Congress ministry. So I suppose I would say that ordinary people are definitely vulnerable to propaganda campaigns for and against particular visions of the future, but the range of ideas and approaches within these propaganda campaigns makes it really important to look at them in nuanced ways. The world of Indian or South Asian politics in the mid-1940s was not as clear-cut or black and white as we're sometimes now led to believe. And I'll just finish by just reminding, I suppose, reminding myself at least, that, you know, when we think of propaganda, again, it doesn't stop, you know, with independence, you know, partition. I mean, again, turning to somewhere like Sindh, you know, the so-called propaganda continues there, whether it's newspaper reports, whether it's more targeted information sharing, because it becomes part of the landscape in that immediate sort of late 47, early 48, those months of late 47, early 48, when, you know, non-Muslims in Sindh were having to make decisions about whether to stay or to go, because in the case of Sindh, people left, you know, the pace, not the pace, but the pattern of their leaving was somewhat different. And in that sort of 6 months, let's say, that followed, we could track and trace propaganda helping them to make their decisions one way or the other. It might not be the kind of propaganda that we're thinking about prior to independence and partition, but it's still a kind of, you know, set of messages being sent out that have real life consequences in terms of relationships within a region or a locality. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you.
It's good.
So I was thinking about rumours and the place of rumours, and rumours are understandably difficult to track as a historian, but I think we could see these in two ways. I mean, one are kind of rumours that just set off incidentally, but seem to take on a life of their own. And there is evidence of rumours. I mean, for instance, Nehru went to Peshawar in 1946, and he was pelted with a rock, and then the rumour spread that he'd been shot. And you can see that in the government archives that spread. So there are kind of ways that certain things take off. And of course, when Gandhi was assassinated, the state was very, very quick in India to make sure that they tried to shut down rumours, because there was a great fear that people would think that a Muslim had killed him, rather than a member of a Hindu nationalist movement, and that would have actually kind of potentially created a very serious another round of violence in India. So there are ways that the state was able to intervene. In fact, they did print on envelopes, if the postal service, sort of anti-rumor messages and pro-communal harmony messages and things. I know, at least in the Indian side. But having said that, of course, it's logical to think of how disconnected and how scary that must have been for people who were separated in families, where post wasn't working, where telephones were disconnected, where they couldn't easily find out what had happened to their families and to their loved ones. And this must have played into the tension and the violence at the time, undoubtedly. And I think there were also certainly people who played on those fears, particularly when there were episodes of violence happening elsewhere, or took deliberately. And the rumour monger is a colonial stereotype, but I think there were people, if we think of the work of Paul Brass, for instance, who shows how people stoke and kind of feed violence sometimes, that there were people taking stories or images, even photographs, from a place like from Calcutta or from Noakhali or from Bihar, and then taking them to other parts of the country, and sort of deliberately stoking those rumours too. So I think rumours work in different ways, but certainly this is a time of huge uncertainty and really lack of reliable information for a lot of people.
Thank you so much. As we can see, I think clearly there's a pattern of loss being implicated in partition as well. So turning back to Dr. Adnan, and I believe all three of you touch upon this in your work as well. So Dr. Adnan, about Lahore specifically, could you tell us how partition led to material and financial losses, especially when you have this movement in which the occupation sector is being altered, but also the economy is being impacted as well? So could you elaborate a bit on the material and financial losses experienced by Lahore during partition?
Okay, thank you, Raja. Thank you so much. If you take Lahore as an urban center of Punjab, then it is very important to consider which community was the most central or pivotal force in the city of Lahore. Who holds the commercial centers? Who holds the private entrepreneurship in the city of Lahore? And that is definitely the non-Muslims. And in the non-Muslims, it was a community of Hindus, not the Sikhs. Sikhs had the least concerns in material terms or in any sort of capitalistic activity in the city of Lahore. So we come across Hindu as the major, in fact, the most dominant segment in the city of Lahore in terms of the commercial capital, in terms of the entrepreneurship, in terms of the money banking sector, private sector. Was completely dominated by the Hindus. And when it comes to the Muslims in the city of Lahore, Muslims, despite having the majority in the city of Lahore, were not having even you can say not the nominal section of the entrepreneurship or the material concerns in the city of Lahore. So in that context, when the partition process happened to the city of Lahore, we see the fleeing of the non-Muslims from the city of Lahore, the Hindus of Lahore. It means that the whole commercial centers, the material business and the private sector was getting stuck for a long time. And the Muslim refugees who came into the city of Lahore were not sufficient or expert or skilled enough to maintain that non-Muslim material entrepreneurship or the commercial setups in the city of Lahore. In that way, we can see that Lahore had to face a lot of hardship when it comes to rehabilitating the refugees in terms of the socio-political, socio-economic activity in the city of Lahore. We cannot find any sort of major rehauling of the city in terms of the industrial hub, in terms of the industrial backbone. Rather, Lahore converted into a city with these small-scale cottage industries. Before partition, we would come across in the city of Lahore the many fine and many huge industries in the city of Lahore. But after partition, we come across with the transformation into the microcosmic, or what you can say, the cottage industry, the small-scale industries. So in that way, we can assess the transformation Lahore had went into the realm of the industrial system.
Thank you so much. I think I'll just pose this disclosure and question to all of the panelists. So I just wanted to ask what your thoughts might be on the memory of partition, particularly from two angles, because how might you see the sources, be it oral history, which has become a very recent trend in terms of witness testimonies, or be it official documents as well. So how do you see the narrative and the memory of partition sort of being utilized for cultural and political ends? But also, how might you see commemorative practices evolving in the future? And the second question I had was about the transfer from individual experience to intergenerational trauma and memory and violence. So I guess, how do you see the memory through the sources being utilized for either political or cultural ends? And then secondly, the transfer from individual to intergenerational, and how might commemoration look like in the future? So we'll start with Professor Talbot.
Yes, thank you. I think that one of the issues, obviously, with oral sources as opposed to documentary sources is that oral sources bring out the subaltern, for want of a better expression, experience of partition. And I think that's important. And we touched on Dalits, we've touched on women in this discussion already. And I think that it's also the other thing that oral sources tend to do. And again, as I've used the word diffuse, there's all these very different experiences that refugees had of partition. And I think that documentary sources tend to give more elite examples, of how people experience partition. One other area which is different, which again we touched on a little bit, but I think I'd like to mention it now, and that is that the discrepancy between how oral sources often emphasize refugee self-reliance. All the documentary sources emphasize the state and the role of the state in resettlement. And I think that I looked at that briefly in a Modern Asian article, special issue, some years ago, which was looking at citizenship and partition and the aftermath, really, of partition. And I think that element, you know, of the state being all pervasive, which it was to a certain extent in the absence of international support, but it wasn't in terms of how many individuals experienced their resettlement, partly because the state wasn't there, partly because the state was corrupt, they couldn't access it, didn't have the social capital, they didn't necessarily have the wherewithal to do this, partly, I suppose, because perhaps refugees, and again, picking up on the issue of pride, refugees wanted to stress that they weren't just victims, so they emphasized their own role in resettlement, perhaps overemphasized it and tended to neglect the ways in which the state may also have worked alongside. So there's all those elements, I think, which are quite important, and they show you different motives of communities, of individuals, and of the state in terms of telling the partition story, and particularly the story of violence and resettlement. Partition, I would like to see as a resource which is constantly being used over the passage of the decades to serve the purposes of different governments with their outlooks in both countries. It's also serving the interest of communities as they evolve and move forward. These stories, of course, are then handed down through the family, and perhaps are further distorted. And I think one of the problems with oral accounts is, as a source, and I'm not saying that they're inferior to documentary sources, because they have their own biases, and they have you have to read between the lines often addressing those, but oral sources are perhaps not always remembered accounts, but what communities have remembered and how people have adjusted their individual memories to community memory. Also, I think how people as families and as communities came out of all of this are very important in how they narrate it. And I think that's an element. I think another element in terms of the generational changes is that there may be an increased sort of nostalgia for a past which didn't really exist, because people growing up in Lahore, not necessarily their children and their grandchildren, but people growing up in Lahore in the 1930s and 40s would have known that alongside communities living together, it wasn't just a sort of golden age.
Yes.
There was a Shahid Ganj episode, to just quote one such episode. You know, there were tensions existing between communities, as well as communities rubbing alongside each other. But I think with the passage of time, people may tend to read back a different past so that existed. That could take two forms. It can be a more sort of black and white past, as Sarah was saying, or it can be a nostalgic rose-tinted past, which also didn't exist necessarily. So that I think all of these things are at play, you know, in terms of how partition is narrated at state level, at community level, at individual level, and how that narration has altered, you know, throughout the decades after independence. Look, going forward, I just make two very brief points, and that is that possibly with the emphasis on sort of citizen historians, crowdsourcing methods in order to get material. This may be another distorting factor. I'm not saying that professional historians always get it right. They may have their own axes to grind.
Yes.
But if people are beginning to collect partition memories that are not trained, they may not be able to perhaps address them, you know, in the more sophisticated and nuanced way that I'm talking about, you know, in my work and in many other people talk about in their work. But I'd be interested to hear what other people on the panel think about how we go forward, you know, and whether we do have a new environment emerging, you know, in terms of collection of memories of partition and what that could mean for how partition is understood. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Yasmin Khan, please.
Yeah, they're really important questions because the context in which partition is being discussed and debated is in modern South Asia, where there are still minorities and people at risk as well of violence. So I feel sometimes that it's really important that we keep oriented towards that and to the present, as well as thinking about the past and how any discussion of this violence should be about helping or preventing or making people conscious of how violence does unfold and how it does happen and how any kind of social groups are susceptible to that and how quickly it can spiral as well. So in that sense, I think the emphasis on trauma I find a bit troubling sometimes if it's not balanced with the emphasis on perpetration, because of course in this context, in partition context, this is people are both victims and suffer awfully, but are also sometimes involved in even just as members of a crowd or as supporters of bystanders of being involved in perpetration. So I think that's to return to Dr. Adnan's book. I think I thought the granular way that he handled all of those things is really impressive, and it shows what can be done with using that combination of textual and archival material and interviews and bringing them both together in the same frame. Because I think if we just rely on interviews, there can be a distorting effect because people will remember what happened to their families and the pain and the trauma that they went through. And Professor Pippa Verdi's article recently that she's written about oral histories of partition is really interesting on exactly this question, I think, because she points to the fact that many of these are being collected now, crowdsourced, using social media in the diaspora, but among particular communities that may want to bolster a perspective. So I think there's lots of creative and new and interesting ways that partition will continue to be studied, but I think we all probably got involved in this in the sense of wanting to think about peace and how and avoiding violence in the future, and I think that has to be a sort of guiding principle too.
Thank you so much. Professor Sarah and Tariq, please.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on Yasmin, first of all, just by, I think, congratulating Adnan on, I think, what he's produced, which is a very honest study. And by this, I mean, it doesn't fall into the trap of taking a defensive view of the past. I think, you explore and you explain the past warts and all, the difficult things, which are not necessarily an easy thing for a historian to do, bearing in mind just how sensitive and contested those past developments can prove to be. And we're all historians in certain places at certain times, and where we're located and when we're located can also be, either sort of restricting for us or in a sense liberating. And I think you've been able to approach writing about the violence of partition in the context of Lahore in a way that avoids putting the blame on one particular group or another, and I just want to commend you for that. So, but going back to the question that we're collectively sort of addressing, really, I don't want to repeat what Ian and Yasmin have just said, because what they've said is so so relevant and helpful. But I'll just emphasise, I suppose, what maybe sort of memories about partition are sort of being put to here in the UK, because I think in a way that follows on from this idea of partition being challenging, because it's not about everyone being a victim. I mean, people are both victims, perpetrators. It's a complicated story. But I think what we find in the UK, and I'm generalizing, so, you know, obviously bear that in mind, but it's offered a means for at least some members of diaspora communities to come together to, in a way, remember, commemorate, not celebrate, but in a sense, collectively remember their shared past, and to stake their claim in the process for being firmly part of 21st century British society, because there's that often repeated point now being made that because of the relationship between Britain and South Asia, what happened in South Asia, you know, needs to be seen as part and parcel of British history. In fact, somebody once said, didn't they, that most of Britain's history took place outside Britain anyway. So it may seem counterintuitive, but I think this is what we're seeing playing out, not all the time, but quite substantially in places like Britain, but made all the more urgent when we see subcontinental tensions, political tensions, surfacing here. And there have been flashpoints, you know, in the recent past where, you know, sort of links to the subcontinent have translated into sort of violence on the streets in cities like Leicester, for example. So I think just to, again, make an obvious point, but it may not be obviously apparent to everyone, that, you know, the majority of people of South Asian heritage in the UK today, you know, they have a connection either to the Punjab or to the borders of Punjab, parts of Kashmir, let's say, or Bengal. And so within their family histories, you know, they probably have connections to partition and maybe to the violence of partition. So they're not that so far removed from it. And so we see attempts to sort of to mark this, to note this, to talk about it. South Asia Heritage Month, that's now into about its 4th year, I think. It runs from the 18th of July to the 17th of August. The 17th of August being very deliberately picked as its final day, because that was the day when the borders were famously revealed, you know, the Radcliffe Line in all its glory. But it was set up by people who used the 75th anniversary of partition to raise awareness of the importance of shared South Asian pasts and cultures in the UK. And there's currently an ongoing initiative in London, backed by the Mayor of London's office, to try and establish some kind of, let's call it, partition memorial in London by the time the 80th anniversary comes round. I mean, London has got various memorials to different aspects of its kind of difficult or colonial or whatever past. And I think this is something that is very important to the people who are engaged in this kind of cross community work. So I would just say that the memories, the narratives, the sorts of things that Ian and Yasmin have just talked about being used for political, cultural ends, commemorative practices, and so forth. There is a lot happening in the UK that can't necessarily happen quite so easily in South Asia itself, when people still remain, unfortunately, very divided by borders, and it's hard for people to come together easily, at least, to do in a way what Adnan has tried to do in his book, which is to talk and explore very honestly, you know, the shared experience that was partition, for, you know, for everything that was involved with it. So that's how I see things moving forward.
Thank you so much, Professor. Dr. Adnan, if you could answer the closing remark question, and then I'll also invite you to read your favorite extract from the book.
Okay, thank you, Raja. First of all, I would like to say my deep regard to every member of the panel, Yasmin Khan, Ian Talbot, and Sara Ansari for being such a generous. I'm sure they have not critically evaluated my book. They have spared me because my book contains a lot of mistakes, and they have shown their generosity by appreciating and appraising my book. Thank you so much, every member of the panel. Okay, I would say one thing that my book is not here with a very huge or big claim of addition in the scholarship. Rather, it intends to produce such kind of a compilation, not compilation. Compilation is not appropriate word. Rather, it intends to produce such kind of study which could claim to present a neutral sort of assessment of the happening in the city of Lahore. So the neutrality is the main theme on which I have produced my research and my book as well. Thank you. I would like to read one paragraph out of my book, and that paragraph comprises not more than 150 words, so it is not going to take much time. The violence in 1947 had paid rich dividends to the lower middle class Muslims of Lahore. That was not what they had planned for. Rather, it was what they longed for. They were finally able to take root in the social space of Lahore. This fact could be understood on the ground that despite having a majority, the Muslims of Lahore did not have a sound profile as compared to non-Muslims in the city. That was the dynamics of that urban poor stratum ultimately determined to exhibit violence in their collective nature. This kind of socio-urban nemesis made them more political to wage violence with locality-imposed sentimentalities. In colonial Lahore, in every incident of communalism, this class crowd played its role, if not proactively, then with strong impressions of imbalance, act of reactions. It could be seen that the role played by that crowd was just an extended performance without having any need to be directed at certain objectives by political camps. It had always taken the local political communal antagonism into the transformation of street fixed violence, and this type was according to the precedent, but the scale was much more striking. It was a priority phenomena in the remaining months of the partition episode, which defined crowd along with the precedent of street violence as a main focus of this argument in order to construct a conception of the patron-client relationship. The main factors underlying the Lahore riots were socio-political rather than economic. That kind of comparative position could not have necessarily converted both communities into binary economic opposition with a level playing field. It was no doubt an important factor in terms of amplifying the hatred among the communities. In this particular context, the notables from the old houses of Lahore had played their role. This study also examined the strata with all the activities they were perpetrating. It was indeed a generalized situation in every right hit domain. Our study has also no exemption with that generalization, but contain its own particularities to its locality in respect of the crowd mentioned with its role in riots and one-side act of violence, culminating in ethnic cleansing. Thus, this described nature was the pivot which generated the whole-scale scenes of street stabbings and individual acts of arson in the following period. It did not need to get assistance from certain and assumed secret hands to have planned any kind of acts. Rather, it was their graduated essence and raison d'etre of having found themselves to perform a determined kind of behavior. That very behavior got itself channelized into a massive outbreak of street fix acts of violence in the city of Lahore. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Adnan. And I guess with this, I would like to thank all our panelists on behalf of the Department of Archive Studies at the Institutional and Global and Historical Studies for their time and attention. I think I can definitely vouch for myself and Dr. Adnan that when we got your replies in our email, we were pretty much a very, very valuable moment for them and a great honor for the Institute to have you join us virtually as well. So thank you to our panelists and audience once again. And we definitely look forward to hosting you in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you.
Before you all leave, could I just bother you for a